Hi there, friends. My name is Rachel GNS Middle. Gilbert and Sullivan is my middle name, and my middle name is my last name. And I am here today with my friend and colleague Marisa Green,
Hi.
and we are going to talk about the Mikado, the controversy surrounding the Mikado, and why I have chosen to stage it in the way that I have. So, first of all, we're going to talk about the situation that happened in Seattle. Just for reference of how I saw the Mikado back in the early 2010s, I actually appeared as Pete Bow, and I am going to use the names in this video because I think it's important because we are having a conversation about the controversy. So in that sense, I do think it is appropriate to use the names. So I was playing Pete Bow in a production of the Mikado. It isn't fair to say that we were doing that with yellowface. We weren't doing specifically Japanese makeup, but we did have black wigs and we did wear kimonos. Nobody batted an eyelid. I didn't think of it as being at all strange. I'd seen several productions of the Mikado before that point that were in full Japanese regalia, and it was only in the early 2010s that it really struck me, certainly, and I think the people of Britain, that it was an issue. So, from your perspective as not just an American, but also an Asian American, can you give us your perspective on this time period and what happened?
Well, I'll start out by saying that I was also in a production of The Mikado once upon a time. I was 12 years old and I played Pooh-Bah, and it was
Yeah.
great fun. And I wore kimonos. We all wore kimonos and the equivalent. I did not wear a black wig, but but other than that, it was by all intents and purposes a traditionally staged Mikado. And then I was also in a production of it at university in which I played Kadisha, again, traditionally staged, no wigs, but other than that, everything that you would probably associate with the standard traditional Mikado setting. And also, nobody batted an eyelid, at least not openly, at least not that I was aware of. But fast forward to the Seattle production, which was when all of a sudden it began to get some traction in the media that this production was being performed by a cast of, I'm pretty sure it was a cast of entirely white actors. I don't know how far they were going in terms of things like wigs or makeup, but it's certainly from the poster image and everything associated with the show was a traditional staging. And this was, I believe, the first time that like I said, the mainstream media outside of people who are interested in Gilbert and Sullivan, or even just people who are interested in opera or classical music in general, were hearing about this show. And if you're not familiar with Seattle, it's a big city, and it's a city with a fairly significantly sized Asian and Asian American population, as are most of the cities on the west coast of the United States. So all of a sudden, you get a few people who are speaking up about how they are uncomfortable with the idea of a white cast putting on a show using Japanese stereotypes meant to poke fun at people. And it made quite a bit of a stir. And all of a sudden, everybody is talking about, should we be doing this show at all? Should we be doing this show with white actors playing Japanese characters? Should we be doing this show if people are going to wear kimonos? Is this hurtful? Is this insensitive? Is this hitting way too close to home in a city and a part of the country where 2 generations ago, Japanese Americans were being held in internment camps?
Mm.
And all of a sudden, everybody is talking about the Mikado and whether we should still be doing it at all, and if so, how we should be doing it.
So the reaction from British people was relatively mixed to this. I remember hearing about this, looking at the pictures of the Seattle production, which were like horrible, really, really horrible, and thinking, how did we ever think this was okay? So that was my immediate reaction. A lot of people reacted differently. And my goal here today is not to vilify these people, but to try and help them understand very gently where I am coming from, where I think you are coming from. I think that generally, when people say that they want to see the Mikado being done traditionally, they're not coming from a place of hatred, they're coming from a place of love. But this doesn't make what they're saying okay, and this doesn't make doing the Mikado okay. But I do want to point out that I'm not kind of vilifying anyone that does think the Mikado should be done traditionally, but I do think it's important to educate people gently about it. And apropos of that, I'm going to tell you some of the knee-jerk reactions that I myself had, which, with a little bit of education, I managed to comb over. So I have been a massive Japanophile all my life. I've even, right now, I'm wearing a necklace from Cardcaptor Sakura, which is my favorite anime. I'm really into Japanese history, Japanese culture. I've been to Japan 3 times on work. I absolutely love the country. I will tell you, though, that I have told a lot of Japanese people about the Mikado, and not one of them seemed offended. In fact, if anything, they seemed quite amused by it. Can you tell me, like, what is the difference here between what, and of course, I'm not speaking for all Japanese people, just the ones I spoke to, but generally, why is this not a problem necessarily with Japanese people in Japan, but more with Japanese Americans? Like, what's the difference there, and why is that important?
That's a really good question. And first of all, you definitely know a lot more about Japan and Japanese culture than I do. I would say you've spent a lot more time there than I have, certainly. Um, and I think you bring up a really good point that in the United States, where everybody's an immigrant from somewhere, and some are certainly more recent than others, it is important to draw some of those distinctions because, for instance, as I'm an American with Asian heritage, but my perspective on things is going to be very different than someone of Asian heritage who grew up in Asia. And particularly for Japanese Americans, again, not one, but as I mentioned earlier, during the Second World War, when the United States and its allies were fighting against Japan, there was a tremendous amount of anti-Japanese sentiment in this country. But what that extended to was not only an enormous campaign of fear, hatred, propaganda against anybody who looked, sounded, etc., Japanese, but even people who were United States citizens living in America of Japanese descent. And so not only were they vilified in the media, but eventually hundreds of thousands of them, particularly on the West Coast, were rounded up and detained in internment camps. And we're talking about United States citizens being treated this way. And if you're in 2014, this is probably people's grandparents or possibly even parents who remember this. So that history is very real and it's very recent. So if you see a poster of people in kimonos, it's going to bring up quite possibly a lot of very specific memories
Mm.
in the way that I don't think you would have that same knee-jerk reaction in the UK or really anywhere else, or quite possibly even in a generation or two when it's a little bit less recent, but it's still pretty recent.
Mm. What would you say to the argument? And I wouldn't genuinely call this much of an argument because I feel like you've already answered this. But it's very commonly said in response to these concerns that the Mikado has actually nothing to do with Japan. It's actually trying to satirize British class and British snobbery. So, because of that, people shouldn't be offended. Can you make sense of that argument?
Well, it's interesting because I think there's two things at play here. One is we have to think about who the people are who are offended, who are threatened, who feel like who to whom this is hurtful. And in many cases, you're not talking to people who have been in the Mikado or gone to see it and then still say, I still feel this way. What you're talking about is people who may not have seen the show or who don't know it and who don't know that it is a satire of British
Yeah.
people, but they see a poster or they see a two-word blurb for this or they see a photo on social media of a white actor in a really unflattering black wig. At that point, kind of the damage is already done. I don't think you're going to get that person into the theater to say, oh, you know what? I was totally wrong about all of
Yeah.
this. So if you're thinking about whether to come see this show or not, what do you want people to know? And what you want them to know is what you want on your poster and in your promotional materials. So let's think about the fact that Gilbert and Sullivan were writing this show in what, 1880 something?
I believe it
And
was
at that,
1885.
okay. And at that point, 98% of their audience had not been to Japan. And they
Mm.
probably didn't know any Japanese people, and they probably didn't know anything about Japanese culture. And to them, Japan is as far away as the moon. Japan and Japanese people aren't your friends from school or your favorite sushi place or the anime that you love to watch. It was it was a fantasy world.
Mm.
And they were looking for something that would be beautiful, which it is, and very different and very exotic, and in some ways, totally not real, so that you can satirize all of these British people and all of these British customs. And they might have picked Japan because there was that exhibition going on and it was all very and it was in the news and everything is very
Yeah.
exciting and this is cool right now. But it didn't have to be Japan. It could have been anywhere that was really, really far away that these people wouldn't have seen. So, Japan to the audience of 1885, I think, represented something completely different than what Japan represents to us.
Absolutely. And the thing is, like, people were saying this back in the 20s. People were saying this back when it was revived in 1926. So this isn't even a new conversation. I think a lot of people are thinking this is part of the new, crazy, woke, tofu eating generation. But we've been having these conversations really since 1907 when Prince Fushimi came over. And as part of that diplomatic mission, the government decided to cancel performances of the Mikado that was going on at that time. And of course, there was a bit of uproar and there was conversations about it. And it turned out the guy himself probably wouldn't have been too offended by it for the reasons we've just been talking about. But the conversation was had. So this isn't a new conversation.
The other reason that we're having this conversation is I think you and I are in agreement that we are having this conversation because we love the Mikado and because it's a good piece of theater
It's the
and
best
we want
one.
to keep doing it. Let me tell you, there are plenty of other light operas written in the Victorian era that have Orientalist or exotic or somewhat racist themes. And we are not having conversations about why we need to keep doing them because they're not that good. And so
Mm,
we're more than happy to put them in the bin and just move on from them. The reason we're doing this is I think we're in agreement with just about everybody that
mm,
it's good enough that it's worth trying to figure out what it means in 2025
yeah.
and how to do it well. Because if we didn't think you could do it well, it would be much easier to just say, you know what, we're going to perform 12 Gilbert and Sullivan
Yeah.
operas instead of 13.
The conversation surrounding offensive material in operas has elicited some changes, even to GNS. There are two instances in the Mikado and one in Princess Ida of an extremely offensive word being used, which I'm not going to say here. And that word was officially removed and replaced with something else. And Gilbert, his intent was never to hurt anybody in writing those words down. In fact, his intents behind those words were actually making fun of white people. He wasn't trying to do anything bad or hurt anybody. But just because Gilbert's intent wasn't to hurt anybody, it doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be removing the horrible language,
Mm-hmm.
because language evolves and some things that may have been thought to be acceptable 100 years ago aren't so now. And of course, like, that just makes absolute sense. And for that reason, I'm not going to say Gilbert was a saint. I'm not going to say maybe he should have thought a little bit more carefully about what he was doing. Maybe he should have done. But I think Gilbert's an excellent playwright. I love him. I love W.S. Gilbert. He's my guy. And I don't think that just because we are thinking of perhaps changing the setting and a few words of the Mikado, that means we are calling Gilbert bad or saying that he was doing a horrible thing. Like, certainly, I'm not saying that, just the same as I wouldn't judge anybody for having the views he did at that time, because the world just wasn't evolved. Britain was in the middle of like empire thinking, colonialization. And was that wrong? Of course it was wrong. But at the time, you wouldn't vilify a member of the public for having that view, because
No.
it was part of British culture. It was brainwashed into people. Gilbert's intent, as you said, was to create a piece that was satirizing British values, but putting it in a setting that was really, really unfamiliar. Because in a sense, that actually heightens the values you're trying to satirize. It's been done 100 times. That's the best kind of satire. That's how satire works. And back then, as you said, Japan was just known to be this mystical, kind of exotic, interesting, faraway land. But now it's just a country. It's just a place. We know a lot about Japan. I've been 3 times. Most people I know have, if they haven't been to Japan, they want to go. They know a lot about the culture. Most people I know watch anime. They even know a little bit of Japanese. It's been totally demystified as a place. And as a result of that, the setting of the Mikado in Japan, for me, actually masks Gilbert's intent, which was to tell the story he wanted to tell. Because now, if you set it in traditional Japanese dress, offending people aside, like, that's a whole separate issue. You're also not really being true to what Gilbert was trying to do.
That's really interesting because, as you just said, offending people aside, I think we're talking about two separate things here. We are talking about what is and what elements are and are not offensive to certain people and not to others. But we're also getting to the fact that one of the great things about these shows is because they're in the public domain, you can, as a director, take some risks, make some choices. I mean, you can set Patience in the 1880s or you can set it in the 1960s. And you know what? If I go to see Patience 10 times, I don't want to see 10 productions that are all identically set in the 1880s. And I don't want to see 10 productions that are all set in the 1960s either. It's more interesting when people make choices and then we can talk about them. I would much rather see something, no matter when you're setting it or what people are wearing it, that says, I've decided to set it here and do this because this is what I think it says about the show, or this is what I think it says about these characters. And I may not agree with all of those things, but even if I don't, then we can all go to the pub after the show and have a really good discussion about it, which is really why you go to the theater anyway. Like, I want to have those discussions. I'd rather do that than be bored. I mean, kind of pretty and boring is not my ideal night at the theater. So I love that people feel empowered and able to make these big choices, even if not everybody agrees with you. That's okay.
So these days, I find that people will often try and update the Mikado in order to escape the controversy, because they're seeing the controversy and the issues around it as being something that hampers them. Whereas in fact, we should really be seeing this as an opportunity. And by saying, look, it's no longer relevant to set it in Japan. For me, it's not even about, like, yes, I wouldn't do it because it's offensive, but it's not even about that for me. For me, it's no longer relevant to set it in Japan. Now, really, you want to set it somewhere where you can really believe that these characters might get boiled alive. And I don't believe that if you set it in modern Japan.
I've seen several productions that update it or change the setting in various ways, some which work better than others. And I've certainly seen the posters and the materials for lots and lots of productions. There are ones that do it, like you said, in modern Japan, and there are bullet trains and there's anime, and it looks really cool. But what you're losing, I think, is the sense of kind of fantasy storytelling.
Yeah.
This is not meant to be real. And also, these characters, I don't think they're not viable 21st century people. So if you want to make the choice to set it in in modern contemporary times, that's fine. And I'd love to have a discussion about that. But for me, I would rather see it done somewhere that feels like it is not from this world, because these situations are really not from this world. And that's what makes them funny and real, and where the actual words of the play ring the most true.
What do you think, Marisa, about the Mikado, which is the Scottish version? Because this is like an interesting one because a friend of mine has recently put it on, and she is Scottish, and so I completely trust like her intent. I trust what she's done. I couldn't see the show, sadly, but then at the same time, you could also argue that there's been a really horrible bloody history between England and Scotland. And so I think you'd also have to be careful as an English person or indeed an American person putting on the Mikado as well. But like what do you think? Do you think it's just as fraught with complications?
Yes and no. Obviously, as an American of both English and Scottish descent, I don't experience the immediacy of that history in the same way that someone who is actually living there. So I'm definitely not your expert. I also think that you can lean into Scottish stereotypes in a way that's ugly and insensitive, just like you do that with others, but you can also lean into them in a way that is not offensive
Mm,
or crude. And again, my guess is that you will not be asking most of your actors to change their personal
yeah.
appearance in a significant way. And I do think that that makes a big, big difference. There is a
Oh,
huge difference
absolutely.
between wearing kilts and then making everybody wear, like, I don't know, giant red wigs, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So,
I could see that
you know,
there would be a really unkind way of doing the Mikado, but as long as you've got
but I don't
plenty of
think they're
Scottish
doing
people on
that.
board, I think
Hmm.
I think it should be fine because you're not really asking characters to change their race. However, it does then face that same issue that I'm talking about as being just a culture that we know about, and so it's just more difficult to kind of make it seem like as dangerous as I think the Mikado needs to be. Because for me, Gilbert's humor usually comes from there being something wrong with the stakes. Like there's some kind of topsy-turviness that's going on, which means that people are either completely underreacting to a very serious situation and speaking very matter-of-factly about it. And that's just like Nankipu and Coco in the scene before the Act 1 finale, like where Nankipu was just very casually saying, well, yes, I'm going to die because you're
Hmm.
marrying the girl I adore.
Hmm.
And but then there's also scenes like where the Mikado has just figured out that the trio have killed his son. And if you look at the text, the Mikado, he's not at all angry. But
Nope.
then the trio are absolutely terrified. And you're thinking, how on earth can we cultivate, like, how can we get the most out of this scene? Getting the most out of that scene for me involves having the trio be absolutely beside themselves with fear, but the character of the Mikado being this absolutely like psychopathic Roman emperor level figure. In fact, Opera Anywhere did set it in ancient Rome, and that's
Oh,
really interesting. And I think
that's
that's a great
cool.
idea, and I would like to see that because that's kind of because the thing is, you can make fun of Rome because you're just punching up, right? It's one of the only existing cultures that I think is totally fair game.
Well, notice we've just had a really good discussion about what's funny and what's going on with these characters.
Yeah.
We didn't mention anything about Japan.
No,
It
just
doesn't need to be Japan.
yeah.
This is different than the gondoliers because some
I
people have
was literally
said,
I was literally about to
wait,
talk about the
wait,
gondoliers. I
wait,
was literally about to bring that up. Sorry, you
oh,
go.
well, okay. Well, I'm the step ahead of you. It's the kind of thing where some people will say, well, okay, why is it not okay to have a show about Japan, but you can have the gondoliers? And it's because, first of all, while yes, a traditional production of the gondoliers is set in Italy, and you have all of these stereotypes about Venice or whatever, there isn't a history of actors being asked to change their appearance significantly in order to play those characters. I might be missing something, but I don't remember anybody being asked to wear wigs that would not match her natural hair color or to do makeup that would be representing somebody of a different race in order to play that character.
I think the opening chorus is a really good indicator of how Gilbert felt about the Mikado and how he felt about the gondoliers. The opening
Mhm.
chorus of the gondoliers is about the fact that there are these two guys that all these
Like,
girls are in love with.
we're
The
doing
opening chorus
stuff.
of the Mikado is just like a list of Japanese stereotypes. And
Mhm.
so maybe if the gondoliers had opened with the chorus about eating pasta, then that would
You'd
be not necessarily not necessarily offensive, but just a bit like that's a bit weird.
Well, it's saying in 5 minutes, what is this show about?
And the reason the Mikado opening chorus is so difficult to fiddle around with and change, and that's I've got my work cut out for me there. Like that's going to be really tough because there's nothing in there about the story
Mhm.
at all. It's
Exactly.
all just about
Hmm.
Japan, and it's completely unconnected to the story. But you have to include the opening chorus of the Mikado because it is a certified banger.
And really, you've got your work cut out for you. But
Yeah.
what you have to do in 5 minutes, or actually it's shorter, is you basically have to say, we are here, wherever here
Hmm.
is. We are here, that's somewhere that isn't Victorian Britain.
Yeah.
And this is how life goes here.
The way I'm going to do that actually is from the text of the Mikado. I'm going to see what these characters tell me. I'm going to see what the story tells me, and then actually create the environment and create the culture from that. And I think that is now the way to do the Mikado. And but also, it's okay to disagree with us. Like we are not the arbiters of everything. And you know what? I saw well, I saw it online, a fully traditional production of the Mikado at the festival in summer of 2023. And that wasn't protested. The people in it were not cancelled. People are still doing it. I don't really agree that it should be done that way, but I'm not going to vilify individuals,
This is the
you
thing
know.
is people are still doing it and they're not being
Mhm.
canceled. I would say one of the biggest risks you would run if you decided to stage your production that way is you would probably lose out on some actors depending
Yeah.
on where you are. I know there are definitely quite a few people who would see that and make the choice not to participate
Mm.
in that production for a whole bunch of reasons. So I would feel badly for you as a company that you might lose out on some talent that you might have access to otherwise. And depending on what people say about you on social media, you may have some feelings about that. But these things are being done, and it's certainly a choice that people are allowed to make.
I've come across this myself in other communities that I'm a part of. I am neurodivergent. I'm part of the queer community. I'm not trans myself, but I like to see myself as a very vocal trans ally. And I always get involved in arguments because I kind of see it as my duty to do that because I understand the situation and I want to help other people understand the situation so that trans people don't have to waste their time doing it. So I do understand that it must just be so exhausting to be part of this community, specifically the Asian American, the Japanese American community, to see that they are putting out their views and opinions that are so much more valuable, like infinitely more valuable than my opinion or the opinion of Gilbert or anyone who's ever done the Mikado. Like they are telling you how they feel about something. They are telling you that it hurts their feelings. They're telling you that they are hurt by it. And that's not because they're a snowflake. That is because it is triggering to a deeply traumatic period in their history and their family's history. And to see that as frivolous and to see the importance of wearing a certain costume in a play as more important than the feelings of those people, I just think that is something to consider. I know what it is to see people who are not the victims in a situation kind of call themselves victims because in their view, they can no longer do the opera that they love to do. But people are still doing it.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. And one of the things that's been really great and eye-opening for me in the last several years of making a lot more British friends and spending a lot of time doing shows with people from other countries and even spending time in the UK myself is, the whole joke is that we're two cultures divided by a common language. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. There are a lot of things, particularly relevant to race, ethnicity, culture that we do experience so differently here than the Brits do, and vice versa. And just because, and I've come to see that just because people are not that do not agree with me completely doesn't mean they're wrong or that they're backwards or that they haven't figured everything out yet, and that we're all kind of trying to get to the same place. But I do think that there is a tremendous amount of goodwill that you can engender by doing your best. And you don't need to get it right all the time. And I certainly don't. And you know what? In 25 years, you and I are going to be having another discussion
Yeah,
about what we did in 2025 that we're like, you know what? I probably would do that differently now.
I've definitely dropped some clangers in my time. I've definitely offended people because we make mistakes and we're all
Mhm,
human. And it's about trying our best not to be automatically defensive and not automatically assuming that people who object to the art that we are putting on must have some kind of ill intention or they're overreactive, they're oversensitive.
mhm.
That
But,
it's
but
about listening and just
yeah.
saying,
And
look, usually people are trying their best and let us all work together to make sure that this piece survives. And
mhm.
honestly, like in my opinion, this isn't just the way it survives, but changing it in the way I'm going to. I'm not saying my iteration of it is going to be perfect, but what I'm saying is the method I am using, I think, is the key to the Mikado's not only survival, but its thriving.
So would you like to tell us a little bit about what you're thinking?
Oh, well, I mean, I think I kind of covered it already. I'm setting it in a fantasy universe. So I've taken this idea that Gilbert wanted us to see this strange, interesting, exotic land. And I'm going to introduce you to these eccentric, strange creatures who are going to tell you this incredible story. And I think just because you won't be used to the setting of it, you
Isn't that kind of the point?
it's going to make the story suddenly appear like a little bit more real because in this culture people really do just get killed at the drop of a hat. Like it's a cruel culture. Like it's vicious, and the people in it, the characters are all very good natured and very kind, but they are ruled over by somebody who would just kill them for the slightest infraction without any hint of regret or anger, just because he can. And that's a terrifying thing. And also, I just like fantasy stuff.
Sure.
I like Lord of the
Absolutely.
Rings. I like Game of Thrones. I love Final Fantasy games. They're a little bit more modern now. They kind of
Mhm.
involve tech now. I'm talking about the old school Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy 3. That's the one. The Japanese Final Fantasy 3. So in a very,
Okay.
very roundabout way, what I'm doing is kind of connected to Japan.
And it's going to
Not
be
really.
aesthetic and it's going to be beautiful and
It's
everybody's going to look great.
it's going to be the best time. And as I say, I'm not saying that my production is going to solve every problem related to the Mikado, but I do believe that it is a step in the right direction. And I do really hope that other people will take inspiration and do their own version of what
Mm.
I'm doing. And I think that if enough people do that, we can just remove it from the trappings of Japan entirely, which, in my opinion, are holding it back. And not just because people find it offensive, but because it's just no longer relevant. It's not it's it's not the story anymore. It doesn't serve Gilbert's intent anymore.
I hope that the next 10 productions in the Mikado I see are all different and all interesting, but I'm very glad that one of those 10 will be yours.
So I think that has been a very fruitful and interesting discussion about the
Yeah,
Mikado.
absolutely.
And thank you so much, Marisa, for adding your extremely valuable opinion and some of the facts that I didn't really know about prior to researching this video properly. So that's been really, really helpful. Again, please feel free to add your own opinions in the comments, but do be kind. I will be removing any comments that are not kind. And again, we are all just trying our best, and we all want to have this show survive because we love the Mikado. It's the best one. That's a spoiler alert for my which is the best Gilbert and Sullivan opera.
Ooh, now I don't know if I agree with you, but we might have to save
That's
that
another
for
story.
for another time.
Thanks so much, Marisa. And if you like what you saw here today, please feel free to subscribe to the channel, give us a like. If you want to see more content like this, where we discuss some of the bigger issues in the Gilbert and Sullivan community, and do check out all our shows there in the description, all of our dates for our shows, places where you can buy tickets, and we will see you for the next video.